Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Erline, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on multi-criteria decision analysis. Can it help make value assessment more patient-centered? Today's webinar is co-hosted by the National Health Council and the National Pharmaceutical Council. Next slide, please. To start off, I wanted to just go over a few housekeeping items. The housekeeping items are, this webinar will be recorded and available on our website afterwards. Please stay on mute throughout the presentation, and please feel free to submit any questions through the chat function. The chat function will be located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have time dedicated at the end to go through any questions that folks might have. We also have contact information for all of our speakers at the end of the session, so feel free to contact with any specific questions. Thank you. We can go to the next slide, please. So before I turn it over to our other speakers, I want to provide a little bit of background information on this topic and why at the NHC we're interested in this topic of multi-criteria decision analysis. So at the NHC, we believe that value assessment is important, that it's necessary, and also that it can improve decision making. But there's broad agreement among many of the researcher community that current approaches to value and health technology assessment inadequately account for the many outcomes, costs, and other aspects of care that are important to and impact patients, as well as other stakeholders. The paper referenced here describes several emerging approaches that might be able to better aggregate the different dimensions of value. They include extended or augmented cost effectiveness analysis, as well as multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA, which will be the focus of today's webinar. At the NHC, we don't have a preference for any single methodology, but what we're really interested in is ensuring that any approaches that are used for value assessment are patient-centered and include and reflect direct input from patients. You can go to the next slide, please. So as part of this project, we wanted to explore MCDA as a possible alternative or complement to traditional approaches to value assessment. So the National Health Council and the National Pharmaceutical Council joined together earlier this year to co-host a in-person roundtable. At the time, it was in February, where we wanted to explore the extent to which MCDA can account for the elements of value that are important to patients. And so what we did was we brought together folks from the patient, academic, payer, and employer, as well as value and health technology assessment organizations with folks from industry to introduce MCDA to those who it was new to. And so we had a really nice active learning exercise to ensure that everybody felt comfortable speaking about MCDA and was able to contribute meaningfully. And then we discussed considerations for integrating the patient voice into patient-centered multi-criteria decision analysis. So if you visit our website, it looks like, Mitchell, thank you for linking that. If you go to our website, you can take a look at the detailed findings from the session, but we'll be going over many of the key findings during today's webinar. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So the objectives for today's webinar are to first of all, introduce you to MCDA and describe the active learning exercise that I mentioned previously. We'll talk about some of the key takeaways from the roundtable, including if and how MCDA could help make value assessment more patient-centered. And then we'll explore opportunities and challenges associated with developing patient-centered multi-criteria decision analysis. So if you go to the next slide, please. I'd like to turn it over to our speakers for today, but let me go ahead and introduce everybody just briefly. So first of all, you'll be hearing from Dr. Brett McQueen, who's an assistant professor and co-investigator at p-value, which focuses specifically on MCDA. And you can see Brett with the beautiful background. Thanks. So he's at University of Colorado and has been a tremendous partner on this project. In addition to John Campbell, who previously was at University of Colorado and really helped us a lot with the project as well. And then we have Kimberly Westrich. Kimberly is the Vice President for Health Services Research at the National Pharmaceutical Council. Thank you, Kimberly. And she'll be highlighting during today's session some of the key takeaways that you can also find described in our white paper, as well as next steps. And then we also are joined today by Jennifer Bright, who is the Executive Director of the Innovation and Value Initiative, or IAVI. And we also are joined by Anna Hyde, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Access at the Arthritis Foundation. And we're really excited to have Jennifer and Anna also joining us today because they've been working over the past couple of years together on developing an MCDA model and can speak specifically to examples of patient engagement in MCDA. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Brett, and Brett will be providing an intro to MCDA and then also going over the case example and exercise. So thank you, Brett.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks again to our partners on this. You know, I think we've had really good collaborations across groups, really from around the world at p-value. It does stand for pharmaceutical value. It's a little bit of a play on statistics there. The biostatisticians were not very happy about that, to be honest, so it's sort of funny. Like Elizabeth said, I'm just going to be going over sort of definitions, terminology, and then we'll get into the sort of roundtable case example, we call it. I would like to acknowledge John Campbell. He's now left academia for a leadership position in value assessment, and then Nick Mendola, one of our graduate students who's working on his dissertation in this area. And of course, there's many more people to thank, including everyone, all the panelists on this call. Next slide, please. So just starting out, for those of you who aren't familiar, what is MCDA? Well, really, multi-criteria decision analysis is just a broad umbrella term that describes a collection of different approaches where we take into account different quote unquote things, right? Criteria that factor into decisions that really matter for people. And, you know, we split those into two. This is fairly recent terminology: qualitative MCDA and quantitative. Qualitative is really focused on identification and measurement of criteria, and then at some level deliberation about those criteria. We're often already sort of doing that in value assessment, but we're not really refined in how we identify and measure the criteria. And we have no weight placed on those criteria from a patient perspective or other perspectives. And then quantitative MCDA is more around, you know, getting to a score that would suggest higher or lower value. And we'll give you an example of what an MCDA score is today. Next slide, please. So how can MCDA help in value assessment? Well, I think everyone on the call knows coverage and reimbursement decisions are judgment calls. They are not completely objective. There are multiple, and I would say even often, conflicting criteria involved. And so there's a tendency for decision makers, or say value assessment assessors, I guess I could say, to bring in their own view or perspective, even if they don't have experience with that disease or therapy. So MCDA can help us enable more of an objective process, or at least transparent process, in how we weight different criteria and quantify those. It's actually been around for decades, used in, I think, forestry management is one of the big examples that we've used in the past. But in my opinion, there's a gap in education, not only on MCDA, but also value assessment in general. So that's one of the early learning lessons that we've had from our grant. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example, I had sort of a few criteria listed on that first slide. But I think it's important to know that there is a little bit of a precedent in evidence here that shows, you know, when we're looking at cost effectiveness or comparative effectiveness, anything that we're using to assess the value of therapies in value assessment, there seems to be these other criteria that kind of creep in, right, and influence votes. And Dr. Peter Newman's group at Tufts looked at this in a great Health Affairs blog post. If you haven't had a chance, you should go see this, where were the votes sort of aligned with cost effectiveness evidence that was presented to the voting panels. And we find that these other criteria are clearly informing the decision or the perception of value. And so you'll see the ones in green down here, like disease state or caregiver burden. Those are sort of often thought of as positives for a therapy if it addresses those issues, reduces caregiver burden, improves productivity. And you can tell some of these criteria we already include in a value assessment process. Some others maybe are more difficult to quantify. The criteria in red then are really shift more towards a negative perception of value for therapies given safety concerns or lack of evidence, which we're used to in value assessment. Next slide, please. So to address that sort of gap in education, NHC and NPC sponsored this roundtable pre-pandemic. That was right before the global pandemic. I can't believe we fit it in. And really the objective was mainly to educate participants on MCDA, but it was through active learning so that we could actually assess, are we seeing a consistent pattern across multiple groups that Dr. Newman's group found in other areas of the healthcare system, other people that are involved in research, patient advocacy, et cetera, just to get their perception of value with and without MCDA. And so just a brief outline, and Elizabeth mentioned this, that the white paper will be available. You can see a lot more details. I do have a time limit and I like to talk, so I'm gonna keep going. So the brief outline was essentially, we described two cases based on traditional value evidence. So cost effectiveness, net health benefit, prevalence, et cetera, almost like a PCOT table, if you will. And then we had participants say, did you think the therapies were low, intermediate, or high value? We then did an MCDA 101. Participants were active in that exercise. And then we had them vote again on the interpretation of value for those two therapy cases. We had a nice mix of patient groups, health technology assessment representatives, other researchers, payers, and industry. So it was a really great group. Next slide, please. So the two hypothetical case examples shown here are quite different in the populations, but the idea was to present therapies that had very similar cost effectiveness evidence. So treatment A for therapy for aggressive B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in adults impacts a very small group of people, right? So we're in that sort of rare disease discussion, depending on your definition. But the evidence supported a net health benefit compared to standard of care or baseline, and then an incremental cost effectiveness ratio that's about at the intermediate to lower value level, with health system affordability a concern given the high price of the therapy. Then we had treatment B, which is episodic migraine in prior preventive patients whom prior preventive therapies did not work. This impacted a larger population, but also had a net health benefit and had very similar cost effectiveness evidence. Health system affordability wasn't necessarily a concern. The price of the therapy was presented as a little bit lower, with discontinuation being quite high, and therefore not necessarily having people on it for a really long time. So those are our two cases. Next slide, please. The steps that I present here are sort of generic to an MCDA exercise, but I want to reiterate that we didn't necessarily go all the way down the road just given our time constraints for all 5 steps, but we did conduct steps 3 through 5. So you'll see 1 and 2, we actually came to the table with pre-specified criteria and then measurement of those criteria. So let's take novelty, or say novel mechanism of action. We pre-specified that as a criteria, and then we had a measurement on each therapy to say, for treatment A, it was quite novel in lymphoma, whereas standard of care is really not addressing the issue at hand. And then we had all of the participants prioritize, so they ranked all of the pre-specified criteria, and then they weighted them. So was it the first two that encompass, say, 50% of the importance of those criteria, or was it more like 25, 75%, et cetera? Then we computed MCDA scores live in the meeting and interpreted them, and then again had them re-vote on the perception of value. And just a caveat here, we had something like maybe 2 to 3 hours to run this exercise. Really, an MCDA policy workshop, now that we've had to sort of shift gears and do virtual, usually takes about 2 days. So just to give you kind of the time frame on that. Next slide, please. So this is an example score that we did for each participant. And also, this is what we've done in other MCDA exercises that we've already conducted. So let's just take one participant voting on treatment A. They have 10 coins to allocate between their top 5 criteria. So they chose novelty, so novel mechanism of action. Obviously, treatment A has some sort of new class of therapy for that disease. Value of hope, was there a potential for a cure for this population? And then level of certainty, both for benefit and safety, and then severity of disease. So you can see here that while they ranked all 5 of these, novelty and value of hope was about 70% of the importance of those 5 criteria. So they placed a lot of weight on sort of the novelty of the therapy and then the value of the potential for a cure. So when we estimate the score, we want to combine the preference weight from this participant, so the 4, 3, 1, 1, 1, and then we have the criterion score, which I mentioned before was pre-specified. So 0 or 100, in this case, it was in a sense 0 or 1. If it was novel, we gave it a 100. If it was not novel, we gave it a 0. There are so many ways to score different therapies, and there's a whole, that should be informed by the evidence, and it's not that straightforward. But again, given limited time constraints, we had to pre-specify that. We then calculate the whole score and we norm it between 0 and 100, where 0 is low value and 100 is high value. So you can see right away treatment A is quite high value from the perception of this participant. So what did we find? Next slide, please. So on the far left column of the top table, you'll see case 1 or treatment A. And the value rating with just the traditional sort of cost effectiveness and net health benefit evidence suggests, treatment A already has a high value placed on it. Almost every participant suggested it was intermediate or high value. And then, after the MCDA exercise, that didn't necessarily change. It shifted slightly to higher value, but MCDA didn't change their perception that that was a lower or a higher value. They thought overwhelmingly this was a high value therapy. And then we look over to treatment B and we see with traditional CEA evidence, there's more of a spread in the distribution of the perception of value. This is the migraine therapy. And then after MCDA, there was really no change in the distribution of the perception of value. So really treatment B didn't alter anyone's MCDA, didn't alter anyone's thinking of treatment B, but it's important to note that there was a group that completely flipped. So the same number of participants that voted for a positive change also voted for a negative change. So that distribution stayed the same, even though those people sort of switched spots. So some of the implications that we see here that I'll present on the next slide is really MCDA did not change anyone's perception of a rare cancer therapy that really could benefit people, but it did have it does suggest that even though there was consistent cost effectiveness evidence, there's these little nuances in other evidence that are playing a part, right? Novelty, value of hope. They are playing a part in value judgments. We've done this with multiple groups now, and we're seeing this over and over again, where just these criteria are sort of creeping into the perception of value. And then about 40 to 45% of participants did change their perception for treatment A and separately for treatment B. But there was no consistent shift. There were really changes to both lower and higher understandings of value. And I think overall, this suggests that, the sort of the rigid structure of value assessment it is, might need some more flexibility. Whether MCDA could be used as a supplemental tool, that's really what we're proposing at p-value, or could it be proposed as a standalone? I think those are important questions that we'll be analyzing going forward. So I think that's my time. I've talked enough, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, this is Kimberly Westridge, and I think that Brett's case study example that he just shared with us did a great job of addressing two of the goals that we had for our roundtable that Elizabeth shared with you earlier. One was being just socializing what multi-criteria decision analysis is, and the second is really demonstrating how to apply it. And I would encourage those of you who are interested in seeing a bit more about his example to go to our white paper. Brett did have to go through it rather quickly today, and there's a lot more detail about the example and how he conducted it and how it changed the results for those of you who'd like to dig into it a little bit more. So what I'm going to be talking about is one of the other objectives for the roundtable, which is really digging into some of the challenges around multi-criteria decision analysis and some potential solutions. Because if it were something that were easy to do, we would be conducting it much more often. So next slide, please. The takeaways really fit into three broad buckets. And I like to think of these buckets as the theory around multi-criteria decision analysis, in particular, how it can be helpful to bringing in that patient perspective. The second is the inputs to multi-criteria decision analysis. And the third is really the practice and application of MCDA. And the way we've bucketed these three areas in our white paper, the theory is MCDA and patient-centricity, the first item on the slide. The second, the inputs, has to do with how the data and evidence for multi-criteria decision analysis are collected. And then the third, that practice and application, has to do with how MCDA is actually implemented and disseminated. So let's go to the next slide, please. Starting with the theory, the patient centricity, we had three main takeaways in this space. The first takeaway has to do with actually identifying that criteria and universe of things that can go into a value assessment. One thing that's critical, of course, is that patient input be used to determine those things. But another side note that's important here, if we cast a really wide net and picked up any possible thing that could go into a value assessment when we're identifying our multiple criteria, we run the risk of double counting. And that's why it's particularly important to identify the things that are most important and focus on those things. That's point number one. Point number 2 and 3 are related, and they go back to that point that Brett made in his presentation, that often those additional value factors aren't included in a value assessment, but when they are included, the way that they're included is not always transparent. So an MCDA approach brings transparency to whether or not these value factors are included and to the way that they're being included. And an MCDA also gives us the opportunity to include those factors. So those were our main takeaways related to theory. Moving to the next slide and thinking about the takeaways related to the inputs, the data and the evidence that go into a patient-centered multi-criteria decision analysis process. Point number 1 is that inputs can't simply be limited to clinical trial data. If you limit to critical trial data, then you are missing some of the richest data that could inform an MCDA, and that includes patient registry data, real-world evidence. Clinical trial data are often limited to a very homogeneous population, and they're not going to pick up the heterogeneity that's inherent in various patient subpopulations. So number 1, don't limit it simply to clinical trial data. Number 2, before investing in a large-scale data collection, talk to the patients, understand which outcomes are most important. So often we're collecting the so-called wrong data because we haven't started with the patients and understood which data are the most important data to collect. Number 3, those data and preferences should be stemming from the people who are going to be impacted by the decision that an MCDA process is going to inform. So that's the patients that are going to be impacted, perhaps the caregivers that are going to be impacted. Number 4, patients and caregivers are not only people from whom we're getting data, they should be full research partners in an effort like this. That's going to enable us not only to identify what's most important, but to be going through the research process in a way that's the most efficient and probably in a way that's going to help us reach the most diverse populations that are relevant in that particular decision context. And finally, it's critical that patients understand how their information is going to be used and that they consent to it being used in that manner. So that is the input takeaways. Moving to the next slide, the application and practice, actually being able to use MCDA for some of these important decisions. Number 1 is understanding that an MCDA process can be a standalone process. It's something that could be used in parallel with the cost effectiveness analysis process, or it can even be combined with a cost effectiveness analysis process. There are a lot of different ways to conduct an MCDA process and different ways to use it, different ways to interpret it. Like I said earlier, if it was something that was easy to do, we would be doing it more often. And that brings us to point number 2. We need to do more research to understand when we can use MCDA. When is it most useful in informing our question? When is it most able to bring in those important patient-centered factors? We need to understand that a little bit better. We need to pilot test it. In order to do that, point number 3, we do have to train more people in how to conduct, use, and interpret MCDA. Point number 4, if we have an expectation that payers are going to be able to incorporate MCDA into some of their decision-making, we need to recognize that they're not going to have the internal resources or bandwidth or training in order to incorporate it. And again, that's where it's going to be very important to have all of these outside researchers who can help assist with it, use in the real world. And then finally, the current interfaces that we have for MCDA are not always as user-friendly as they could be. And that's an area that we need to work on in order to get to the point where we can implement and disseminate MCDA in the real world. Next slide, please. So what were some actionable next steps that we identified in order to get to this use in the real world? Number 1, the development of a high-quality standardized data collection tool. This would allow us to conduct standalone surveys or perhaps embed it in patient registries to collect that data that we've identified as being important in a robust way that it can be used to inform an MCDA. Point number 2, support that additional researcher-facing education. Currently, there are short courses available at ISPOR that can train folks in how to do MCDA, and there's some graduate work that trains in it, but we need some more to really make sure that we've got a full complement of researchers who can conduct it and understand it and implement it. And then finally, number 3, further research in a couple of areas. What does this look like? Number 1 is research asking patients and caregivers, what is most important? What is the data that we should be collecting? That's going to help inform our process, make sure that we're getting that patient-centered voice into MCDA. Number 2, we need to pilot test it. We need to understand where it can work, how it works best, how it compares to traditional cost-effectiveness analysis approaches. And then as we're doing that research, we need to continue to have convenings where we're bringing the stakeholders together and talking about what are best practices, what have we learned, what can we do better? And if we do all of these things, pull together a standardized high-quality data collection tool, support additional researcher-facing education, and then conduct that needed research, keep doing those convenings, that's going to help us get to the point where we're not just theoretically thinking about how MCDA can bring the patient voice into value assessment and support healthcare decision-making. We're going to collect the data that will support those inputs, and we will get to the point where we can actually apply and use MCDA in the real world to support high-quality decisions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Bright and Anna Hyde to tell you a bit about a real-world RA model that has an MCDA component and worked with patients as research partners throughout the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Bright. I'm the Executive Director for IAVI, and I'm very glad to be part of the conversation today. I will say that this presentation is going to go a little bit afield in that when we presented in February, we really could just point to the work that we have done in rheumatoid arthritis, but I'm happy to tell you that IAVI is very heavily invested in this area and all the action areas that Kimberly just outlined. So I'll leave at the end with just a bit about what we're working on currently, and then look forward to the conversation. Next slide. So the first thing, just to level set, I'm sure there are many people on the phone who are aware of IAVI, but if you're not, we are multi-criteria focused. I think that's part of our mission, is to explore both the scientific methods and the practical challenges, especially what Kimberly just outlined, some of the practical implementation and dissemination issues to improve value assessment. And one of the biggest areas that we're focused on is how do we bring those patient perspectives collaboratively inside of value assessment. So we're talking about both the qualitative side that, that Brett mentioned and the quantitative side. And both of them have their own challenges. And sometimes it feels like we're moving the boulder up the hill, but I think this is part and parcel of what IAVI lives and breathes every day. Next slide. Just briefly, you know, you heard Brett's really great coverage of a very complex exercise that we went through, but to reinforce something Kimberly just said about multi-criteria decision analysis isn't the silver bullet. It's a tool. It is a one in a whole arsenal of things that we should be doing to improve the representativeness and the transparency and the 360 view, if you will, in value assessment. And so when we think about that here at IAVI, we think about our big toolbox. And it's not, these are all component parts, but that notion of first we have to get to identifying within patient communities and even across patient communities, what are the priorities? What are the preferences, the decision factors that affect their everyday experience and those of their caregivers or families? What are those factors? Not just in terms of outcomes, which we have an enormous amount of investment in patient-reported outcomes, but most importantly, what are the priorities? What are the unmet needs? What are the factors that drive their decision-making and have an impact both on the outcomes clinically, but also on things like adherence or ability to access care? So we need to do a better job of understanding that. Kimberly referenced the fact that this is a major area of data collection that we need to work on, and this is one in our toolbox that we take very seriously in our work. The second is obviously in those novel elements of value that the ISPOR task force brought forward. That gets into more of the quantitative side. So what the patient defined priorities are more the qualitative, and this is the quantitative calculation. We rapidly get into complex math that I am not an economist, so I rely on Brett and others like him to help guide the way in terms of methodology, but there are established mechanisms and formulas and math to help us see a different view. And again, at IAVI, we talk about this is a tool to help give insight. It's not an answer. And I know that's frustrating to any of the payer decision makers that may be on the phone, but the purpose of value assessment is really to guide our thinking, help us understand the purpose of evidence and perspective that's coming from the patient community, and then apply that to the best of our ability to decision making that is complex, but certainly is localized. And localized meaning at the payer, purchaser, clinician, patient source. And then finally, obviously, the purpose of this call is to really talk about one of the big tools in our box beyond cost effectiveness analysis, which is MCDA. And again, we view it very much like Kimberly portrayed it, as it's a comparator. It's another way of looking at it to see, do you see different signals? And we have invested heavily in this area because we see it as more inclusive, more transparent, and more useful, frankly, to all the decision makers that need this information. Next slide. So to get to the heart of the matter, let me tell you a little bit about what IAVI has done, and then I'll leave you with what we're working on now in this area. So in 2017, we were undertaking our very first prototype value assessment model focused on rheumatoid arthritis, and we worked closely with patients in the rheumatoid arthritis field to identify what are some of the key factors that define value to them and to their treatment based on their experience. And some of the just top line findings, first of all, it was an affirmation that the value, any concept and modeling of value has to incorporate patient perspectives to be relevant, because it does matter. And issues related to assessing functional status, daily quality of life, mostly tied to independence and functioning, were really high on the patient priority list. And those are not necessarily factors that are well captured in clinical trial data, for example. And then on another level, frequency of treatment administration, site of administration, mode of administration were also very strong key considerations from the patient perspective, in addition to the out-of-pocket costs. So we often hear in the policy narrative that costs are really the only driver that matter to patients. And yet what we found through our study, and it should be no surprise to anybody who works in patient communities writ large, that in fact, yes, costs matter, but there are other things that drive decision-making about which treatment is favorable to that patient, and that have impact on other things like ability to care for family, work, all of those things. So then what we did with that information is worked to include those attributes in our model, which would allow for the adjustment of the analysis, and again, complex math happening in the background, to address things. And one example was based on mode of administration. And that helped us see two things. One, where there might be differences in cost effectiveness, but also improvements, opportunities for improving sequence of treatment, which in this disease state in particular is a big issue. We see many, many patients starting and having to progress steadily through all the available treatments. And so it is a very strong need in this disease state to understand what are optimal treatment pathways and for whom. And I do not say that IAVI figured it out, but I think we saw some signals through this research that I think amplify this call for we need to invest more in this line of thinking, to Kimberly's point. One of the ongoing challenges that we've experienced, and it's been alluded to, is that we have to improve these data inputs. There's a lot of need and questions, and not always the right data to input into a multi-criteria decision analysis. So we need to invest there, and we need to do it in partnership with patients. I couldn't agree more with that, that basic premise. And I think next slide, I think maybe one of my slides, oh no, it is there. Great. So this is just a little bit about what we're doing, and then I will hand over to Anna to talk about her and our experience together collaborating with the Arthritis Foundation. So we are currently investing in some next phase research. First, we're working with RAND to use a different approach to something called goal attainment scaling, which again is a method that's been around for decades, and working with the rheumatoid arthritis patient community to refine a set of preferences that could be applied to an MCDA analysis. So it's a little more vigorous research methodology to find inputs for an MCDA analysis in this disease state. We're also working with the PAVE Center at University of Maryland to begin to identify and prioritize patient preferences with for patients who have major depressive disorder. And that establishment of what the priorities are is going to directly tie into some quantitative analysis that we hope then will eventually live and breathe inside our next open source value model prototype on MDD, which we'll be developing throughout next year. So you can see that IAVI is very much grappling with all of these sticky issues that Brett and Kimberly both raised, and we're leaning into the research that's needed to really move this field forward. So I hope, I hope we keep this dialogue going, and I look forward to bringing back some further insights based on our work. So with that, I want to invite Anna to come on screen and talk to us about the experience from her perspective. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. This is Anna Hyde with the Arthritis Foundation. I apologize, I am not on video at the moment. I'm having some logistical challenges with construction in my building and wanted to find a corner that was going to be quietest. So hopefully I can return to video soon. But in the meantime, I just kind of want to follow on some of the things that Jennifer was talking about, working sort of hand in hand on that RA model. Personally, I've learn something new every single day from the patients that we work with, and have seen the value, and just really eat, sleep, and breathe it of engaging patients and really everything that we do. So I just wanted to quickly go through just a handful of, these are some of our experiences, but I wanted to sort of extrapolate out some of the ways that we've collected and used patient data, and how really applicable that is, across any patient group. So, I mean, certainly one of the more common ways is through patient registries and patient-reported outcome surveys. We do this at the Arthritis Foundation. I know a lot of organizations do this. It's not always easy. It can be time and resource intensive to do. And I certainly think one of the challenges is that there's not necessarily a sort of standard way to do it. Being able to sort of collect uniform data across therapeutic areas, for example, is a challenge, and even within therapeutic areas. Patient-focused drug development meetings, the same rule applies in terms of being sort of time and resource intensive to do these, but we've done 2 of them, one for juvenile idiopathic arthritis and one for osteoarthritis. And the insights that the patients give are really invaluable. And to be able to have, the FDA and the NIH in the room, for example, in the case of the 2 meetings that we did, hearing directly from patients about what matters to them in their treatment, and the outcomes that they're looking to achieve in their disease state, really invaluable. I still carry a lot of those with me, even though it's been a couple of years since we've done one. Disease-specific surveys and focus groups, of course, I think this is a bread and butter for many patient groups, surveying your constituents to find out specific information. We do general surveys so that we can benchmark data over time, but we also do deep dive surveys, which really yield a lot of interesting insights into all sorts of topics. And then focus groups, we find that having that mix of quantitative and qualitative data is really helpful. It's not very often that we conduct a survey and analyze the results and don't have questions about what does this really mean? What did these patients think when, of specifically when they were answering this question that way? And the ability to really dig in further. And even in many cases, we'll do one-on-one interviews with patients to really drill down into an area. We would say a best practice here, most definitely, is to ensure you have a volunteer leadership that is trained and empowered to inform the data collection. It's really just a practice what you preach mantra. I've learned this the hard way, most certainly, and of course corrected, and again, understand the value of engaging patients in not just participating in your work, but actually helping to crafting the survey questions and things like that, and being trained so that as they're engaging in any setting, whether it's internal or external, that they understand what the purpose is, what their ask is, and who their audience is. Okay, so using this data, this follows on directly, so I don't want to be duplicative here, but some of the recent examples of how we've used patient data informing the FDA and NIH decision-making processes. And currently there are multiple opportunities to do that with all of the user fee reauthorizations, impacting value assessment methodology and processes. So you just heard the example from Jennifer about the RA model. So that's a case in point there. And we have also worked with other value assessment organizations and others around this. Informing PCORI, this is another very timely example as they are updating their principles. Other comparative effectiveness research-related agencies, we are looking forward to what the next few years may bring in coordinating all of this work. There's been a lot of really good groundwork laid here recently. And then of course, I mean, ultimately the goal of all of this patient engagement is to help guide and empower patients directly in their treatment decisions. And I know there's a lot of tension between whether value assessment can and should be used at the population level versus the individual patient level. But we're hoping that it can have a just net benefit across the board. And that by us engaging more with patients and training them on how to engage with us, that they will then just inherently feel more empowered to use what they're learning in their treatment decisions. So I'll stop there. I know we'll have time for Q&A and can dig in further to some of the specifics that, we specifically with IAVI have sort of seen with our patients, but wanted to just say thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I will invite all of our speakers to come onto camera one more time. And I understand if you're in a hallway somewhere, don't worry about that. But, if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But we've already had a couple come through, so I will jump right in. So the first is, part of the reason why we started this conversation is, of course, that we feel that traditional approaches are insufficient. But one that I wanted to maybe touch a little bit more upon, and that we also covered during the roundtable is, if you, maybe this is for Kimberly and for Brett, if you could speak a little bit about how MCDA could be a complement or an alternative to cost effectiveness analysis, a traditional cost effectiveness analysis, and what, at a high level, what shortcomings of CEA does MCDA overcome?
Thanks, Elizabeth. This is Kimberly. I'll go first and then let Brett take a whack at it. And I'm glad you asked this question, because this is a point that I didn't make as well during my earlier remarks as I'd like to. One of the challenges with cost effectiveness analysis is that many of these criteria, many of these things that are important to patients in society are not easy to incorporate in cost effectiveness analysis, or can't be incorporated at all. So what MCDA does for us is it allows us to bring these criteria into a value assessment, which of course helps us make sure that we're picking up the patient perspective. As far as how it can be used with cost effectiveness analysis or augment a cost effectiveness analysis, there are a lot of different ways to do MCDA. And it can be used in many different ways. It could be something that stands alone on its own and is interpreted. It's something that can be next to a cost effectiveness analysis, and you can compare the two and see how they're different. There's also something called augmented CEA, where the results of an MCDA process and a cost effectiveness analysis can actually be blended together to pick a different answer. And this is why I think it's so important that we do pilot testing, so that we can understand in which situations MCDA is working the best and how it could be used with conventional cost effectiveness analysis if we'd like to go in that direction. So those are my thoughts, and I'll let Brett chime in with additional thoughts that he might have.
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. We are at p-value testing MCDA as a supplement or complement to traditional value assessment. And most of the reasoning there, is that cost effectiveness does a decent job of estimating the value of a therapy when there's a lot of evidence available. And I think when you start looking at rare disease, one-arm trials, certain disease states where there's just not a lot of evidence, it becomes really difficult. I'm a modeler myself to model those situations. And that's where we think MCDA can really help the most. And so we're really looking more at rare disease, a set of rare disease for our applications. And the other thing to note is that cost effectiveness itself, regardless of whether you agree with it, is a criteria. and could be considered a criteria for MCDA. So I think you can look at it multiple ways, but I think it really has to go back to decision context and perspective. I know, I thought it was a great comment that Anna made, that MCDA can actually inform anything from individual treatment decisions up to coverage and reimbursement. However, we have to make sure that we're weighting our responses to the decision maker at that point and have some grounding in the end user that's using the therapy. So that's at least how we're approaching it. Not saying that that's necessarily correct, but we will find out.
Great, thanks, Brett.
Elizabeth, can I just weigh in
Yes.
from so I agree with all the comments that have been made, and just to say that the pilot testing part is where IAVI lives. That's what we're really trying to do. And, I think that the opportunities here are to work hand in hand with the patient communities to begin to identify what are the most efficient pathways to understand what those high priority factors are, and to begin to answer the question, can we identify a subset that exists across disease states? Fatigue or functioning is a common thread across many conditions. Now, it might be defined differently, how we measure it and things like that, but if we can get to a point where in a consensus way, we can agree that there are important aspects of patient perspective and care, their experience, what they're aiming for in terms of their treatment outcomes that exist across disease states, frankly, I think all of us win, because we're not measuring it consistently now. We're not bringing it into existence in the evidence generation function on a consistent basis, and hence we're not incorporating it into our decision making. We're only using a dollar amount and a scientific measure of effectiveness that is often misses the mark in terms of its relevance to patients who really are living with the condition. They're not middle-aged white males, for example. And so this is an area that is complex, but it's to echo Kimberly, it's a really important area for investment, and we all have to lean in and identify what those priority questions are. So I see a lot of different questions in the chat that I think are getting at the heart of the matter.
Yeah, definitely. So, just building on that and asking if additional folks had any comments, I wanted to go to Anke's question, which was very much related, which is how much of the resulting MCDA value assessment can or should be generalized across different technologies, and what has to be adapted to a specific technology or a specific disease state.
I mean, I would say that's where the pilot testing issue comes up again. I think we don't have, two things. One, the depression model work that I alluded to IAVI's working in, we are looking to build a model that looks across intervention technologies. So not just drugs, but all the different therapeutic options that exist for major depressive disorder. So, and we intend to do an MCDA analysis. So that becomes very relevant, but I can't predict what we're going to learn along the way. When we go across disease states, I think first, one of the things we've heard in our collaboration with all kinds of stakeholders, including patients and decision makers, payers and employers, is that we've got to prioritize. We can't boil the ocean. And that gets back to my prior comment about can we pick the top 5? And I'm not suggesting they're the only, or even that the 5 is the right number, but just for sake of argument, can we identify the things that cut across disease states most consistently, that are really problematic in terms of measurement, but that matter to patient decision-making, to caregivers, to the outcomes that we're aiming for in care? And if we can get to some consensus about that and begin to tap into what to measure and when and how to incorporate that, I think we will materially move this conversation forward.
And I think it goes nicely back to Kimberly's point about the standardized data collection tool that could be developed and that could be used broadly, and frankly can be used broadly as well. It can be used in MCDA, can be used for traditional methods, can be used across the board in terms of decision making. So I wanted to go to the next question, which is about, do you typically recruit patients as partners, or do you go out to third parties to find the right patients to speak to? So I think this is a question for Jennifer and for Brett specifically about.
Yeah. Well, I can speak to how IAVI does it. It's a little bit of both, but I would say that when we did the rheumatoid arthritis study, we partnered with patient organizations to help identify and connect to patient communities. But we did use a third-party focus group administrator to help us do those structured interviews and focus grouping. This time around, with regard to the MDD model, we have taken a different approach. We have recruited a multi-stakeholder advisory group to sit with us at the very beginning, and includes 4 or 5 patient organizations with expertise in this disease area. And they have been instrumental in helping us recruit patients to participate in the patient preference study work that PAVE is working on. So we are starting with a smaller end to help us define the major and prioritize the attributes. And then we will be doing a very in-depth discrete choice experiment with over 300 patients in the community all across the country. And we have, goals in terms of demographics and things like that. But the patient organizations have been instrumental, as have the clinicians. We need to remember that patient advocacy groups can help us, but it's only through a multi-layered approach that we're going to really get to patient communities that are relevant to these hard questions. And I think to that point, one of the challenges we've had is in making sure that we're reaching communities of color and socioeconomic demographics so that we don't end up with all Caucasian middle-aged males or females in the study group. And so we're reaching out yet again to some other organizations to help us think through what are the best strategies to bring those people and their perspectives into this research.
I want to follow that point because I was going to say that exact thing. It's the same groundwork building. We've made so much progress. We have a long way to go. But doing the focus groups and things like that, you learn a lot, you learn the importance of it, but you also, it's easy to get inside your echo chamber. You train a set of patients, and it's easy to use those same patients. You're trying to find people who maybe already have some expertise in a particular area. But now we need to sort of branch out and identify other patients who are underrepresented. So I think that's an important frontier for all of us to think about moving forward.
Great. I think we're oh, go ahead, Brett.
And I just, it's a similar approach for us. We are a bit lucky that we're on a medical campus, and so we have access to clinicians and experts in that area. So our plan is to work across 3 different disease states, NMOSD, SMA, and then multiple myeloma, all 3 of which have diversity in age and racial and ethnic makeup. And so I think Jennifer, and I think all 3 of you made this point that, we're trying to find common ground across multiple diseases, and then also look at disease-specific measures. And so those will be focus groups with patients, providers, and their caregivers. So.
Great, thank you so much. I can't believe it's already 11:59. We have lots more questions that were put in the chat, but we're just about at time. But I wanted to make sure that everybody had this slide because it does list the email addresses for all of the speakers during today's session. So feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any specific questions or just want to learn more about the project or get engaged in our work as well. We appreciate it, and we really appreciate you joining today's session, and encourage you to take a look at the white paper, which includes a lot more details. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.